So one of the traditions when we study quantum mechanics is me reading you a passage from this book, Alice in Quantumland. And so we can't do this in class, so I'm just going to read to you. Feel free to grab some Oreos and maybe a glass of milk, kind of settle in and have a little bit of story time, you know, nothing really academic. So here we go. From Alice in Quantumland. Alice was bored. All her friends were on holiday, visiting relations, and it was raining. Kind of like it is today. By the way, today is Thursday. So that she was marooned indoors watching television. So far that afternoon, she had watched part of 5 of a series on Introductory Esperanto, a program on gardening, and a paid political broadcast. Alice was really bored. She stared in frustration at the screen, which at that moment carried a picture of the Prime Minister telling her how, all things considered, everything was really far better than it had been 3 years ago. And even if it hadn't always seemed that way. As she watched, she was mildly surprised to see the picture of the Prime Minister's face slowly break apart into a mist of bright dancing speckles which all seemed to be rushing inward, as if they were beckoning her. "Why?" said Alice. "I do believe they want me to follow them in." She leapt to her feet and started toward the television, but tripped on the book which she had discarded so untidily on the floor and fell headlong. As she fell forward, she was amazed to see the screen grow enormously, and she found herself in amongst the swirling speckles, rushing with them down into the picture. "I cannot see anything with these dots swirling all around me," thought Alice. "It's just like being lost in a snowstorm. Why, I cannot even see my feet. I wish I could just see just a little. I could be anywhere." At that moment, Alice felt her feet strike something solid, and she found herself standing on a hard, flat surface. All around her, the swirling dots were fading away, and she found that she was surrounded by a number of vague shapes. She looked more closely at the one nearest to her and observed a small figure coming roughly up to her waist. It was exceedingly difficult to make out, as all the time it kept hopping rapidly to and fro. Moving so fast it was very difficult to see it all clearly. The figure seemed to be carrying some sort of stick, or possibly a rolled umbrella, which was pointing straight up in the air. "Hello!" Alice introduced herself politely. "I am Alice. May I ask who you are?" "I am an electron," said the figure. "I am a spin-up electron. You can readily tell me apart from my friend over there who is a spin-down electron. So, of course, she is quite different." Under his breath, he added something which sounded rather like "Viva la difference." As far as Alice could see, the other electron looked very much the same, except that her umbrella, or whatever it was pointing down towards the ground. It was very difficult to tell for sure, as the figure was jiggling to and fro as rapidly as the first. "Oh, please," said Alice to her first acquaintance, "would you be good enough to stand still for a moment, as I really cannot see you at all clearly." "I am good enough," said the electron, "but I'm afraid there is just not enough room. However, I will try." So saying, he slowed his rate of jiggling, but as he moved more slowly, he began to expand sideways and became more and more diffuse. Now, although he was no longer moving at all quickly, he looked so fuzzy and quite out of focus that Alice could no more see what he looked like than what she had been able to see before. "That is the best I can do," he panted. "I'm afraid that the more slowly I move, the more spread out I become." That is the way things are here in Quantumland. The smaller the space you occupy, the faster you have to move. It's one of the rules, and there is nothing I can do about it. There isn't really enough room to slow down here," continued Alice's companion, as he began to once more move rapidly back and forth. "The platform is becoming so crowded that I have to be more compact." Sure enough, the space in which Alice stood had now become very crowded indeed, being very closely packed with small figures, each dancing feverishly to and fro. "What strange things," thought Alice. "I do not think I shall ever be able to quite see what they look like if they will not stand still for a minute, and there does not seem to be much of a chance for that." Since it did not look as if she could get them to slow down, she tried another topic. "Would you please tell me what sort of platform we are on?" Why a railway platform, of course, replied one of the electrons cheerfully, as it was very hard for Alice to say which one had spoken. They really did all look very much the same. We're going to take the Waves train to the screen you see. You will change there to the Photon Express, I expect, if you don't want to go any further. Do you mean the television screen? Asked Alice. Why, of course I do, cried one of the electrons. Alice could have sworn that it was not the same one which had just spoken, but it was very difficult to be certain. Come on, the train is here and we have to get on. Sure enough, Alice could see a line of small compartments drawn up on the platform. They were very small. Some were empty, some had one electron in, some had two. All of the empty compartments were filling rapidly. In fact, there did not seem to be any left. But Alice noticed that not one of the compartments held more than two electrons. As they passed by any of these compartments, the two occupants would cry out, "No room, no room." Surely you could squeeze more than two into a compartment, seeing as the train is so crowded, asked Alice. Alice asked her companion. Oh no, never more than two electrons together, that is the rule. I suppose we shall have to get into different compartments then, declared Alice regretfully, but the electron reassured her. Oh, there's no problem there for you, no problem at all. You can get into any compartment that you want, of course. I'm sure that I do not see why that should be, Alice replied. If a compartment is too full to hold you, then it must be surely be too full for me as well. Not at all. The compartments are only allowed to hold two electrons, so almost all the places for electrons must be taken up. But you are not an electron. There is not a single other Alice on the train, so there is plenty of room for an Alice in any of the compartments. This did not seem to follow, so far as Alice could see, but she was afraid that the train would start to move off before they got their seats, so she began to look for an empty space that could take another electron. How about this one, she asked her associate. Here is a compartment with only one electron in it. Can you get in here? Oh, certainly not, he snapped, sounding quite horrified. That is another spin-up electron. I cannot share a compartment with another spin-up electron. What a suggestion. It is quite against my principle. Don't you mean against your principles? Alice asked. I mean what I say, against my principle, or rather Pauli's principle. It forbids any of us two electrons from doing exactly the same thing, which includes being in the same space and having the same spin. So, down here, it explains the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which says that no particle can have well-defined values of both position and momentum. So that means that a particle cannot be stationary in a given position since the stationary particle is well-defined. Now, as far as the Pauli exclusion principle goes, electrons are absolutely identical and obey the Pauli exclusion principle, which prevents there being more than one electron in each state, and hence the difference in the spin. Okay. Alice did not really know what she had said that upset him, but she looked around hastily to find another compartment which might suit him better. She managed to find one that held a single electron who was of the spin-down variety, and Alice's companion leaped into this one readily enough. Alice was surprised to find out that although the tiny compartment now seemed full, there was somehow enough room for her to fit in quite easily. No sooner when they settled in than the train moved off. The journey was uneventful and the scenery was not very interesting, so Alice was rather glad when the train began to slow down. This must be the screen, I suspect, thought Alice. I wonder what will happen here. As they alighted at the screen, there was an enormous bustle everywhere. Where is everyone going? Alice wondered aloud. Why does everyone seem so excited? Her questions were answered by an announcement which appeared to come from the air around her. The screen phosphor is presently being excited by the incoming electrons, and we shall be having photon emission very soon. Stand by for the departure of the Photon Express. Alice looked around to see if she could see the express arriving, when there was a rush of bright shining shapes, that's tough to say, bright shining shapes, across the platform. Alice was caught up in the middle of the crowd and carried along with them as they all crowded into one compartment. Well, they do not seem to be worried by any principle, Pauli or otherwise, thought Alice as they crowded in around her. These ones are certainly not worried about being in the same place. I suppose the express is going to start soon. I wonder where we shall end up, she concluded as she stepped out onto the platform. My, that was certainly a fast journey. Why, it seemed to take no time at all. Alice was quite right about this. The journey did indeed take no time at all, as time is effectively frozen for anything which is traveling at the velocity of light. Once again she found herself surrounded by a crowd of electrons all rushing away from the platform. "Come along," one of them cried to her as it rushed off. "We must get out of the station now if we are going to get anywhere." "Excuse me?" Alice asked it tentatively. "Are you the same electron that I was talking to before?" "Yes, I am," answered the electron as it darted off down a side passage. Alice was swept along by the crowd of electrons and carried through the main gate. "I declare that is really just too irksome," said Alice. "Now I have lost the only person I know at all in this strange place, and I have no one to explain what is happening." "Don't worry, Alice," said a voice from about knee level. "I will show you where to go." It was one of the electrons. "How do you know my name?" asked Alice in surprise. "That's simple. I'm the same electron that spoke to you before." "You cannot be," exclaimed Alice. "I saw that electron go off in a different direction." "Perhaps he was not the same one I was talking to before?" "Certainly he was." "Then you cannot be the same one," said Alice reasonably. You cannot both be the same one, you know." "Oh, yes, we can," replied the electron. "He is the same, I am the same, we are all the same. You know, exactly the same." "That is ridiculous," argued Alice. "You are here beside me, while he has run off somewhere over there. So you cannot both be the same person. One of you must be different." "Not at all," cried the electron, jumping up and down even faster in his excitement. "We are all identical. There is no way whatsoever you can tell us apart. So you see, he must be the same, and I must be the same too." At that point, the crowd of electrons which surrounded Alice all began to cry out, "I am the same too, I am just the same as you are. I am too, just the same as you." The tumult was dreadful, and Alice closed her eyes and put her hands over her ears until the noise died down again. When it was quiet again, Alice opened her eyes and lowered her hands. She found there was no sign of the crowd of electrons which had been clustering around her, and she was walking out of the station entrance all alone. Looking around, she found herself in a street which at first seemed quite normal. Then she turned left and began to walk across the sidewalk. A little further along, she came by an empty lot by the side of the road with a group of builders was clustered around a pile of bricks. Alice assumed that they were builders as they were unloading more bricks from a small cart. "Well, at least these people seem to be behaving in a sensible manner," she thought to herself. Just then another group came running around the corner carrying what looked like a very large rolled-up carpet and proceeded to spread it out on the site. When it was unrolled, Alice could see it was some sort of building plan. It did seem to be rather a large plan since it covered most of the available space. "Well, I do believe it must be exactly the same size as the building they are going to put up," said Alice. "But how will they manage to build anything if the plan is already taking up all of the room?" The builders had finished easing the plan into position and retreated to the pile of bricks. They all picked up bricks and began throwing them at the plan, apparently quite at random. All was confusion. Some fell in one place, some in another. And Alice could see no purpose at all in what they were doing. "What are you doing?" she asked a person who was standing to one side. He appeared to be doing nothing, but she assumed him to be the foreman. "You are just making untidy piles of bricks. Aren't you supposed to be putting up a building?" "Ah, sure, and we are, me darling," answered the foreman. "Ah, it's true. It's that the random fluctuations are still large enough to hide the pattern. But since we have laid down the probability distribution for the result we are after needing, we'll get there. Just never fear." Alice felt that this display's optimism was not very convincing. But she kept her peace and watched as a shower of bricks continued to descend into the site. Gradually, to her amazement, she noted that more bricks were falling in some regions than in the others, and she could begin to make out patterns of walls and doorways. She watched in fascination as the recognizable shape of rooms began to appear out of the initial chaos. "Why, that is amazing," she cried. "How have you managed to do that?" "Well now, haven't I told you already?" smiled the foreman. "You watched us lay down the probability distribution before we began. This specifies where there should be bricks and where there should be none. We must do this before we start bricklaying, as we cannot tell where each brick will go when we throw it, you know," he continued. "I do not see why," Alice interrupted him. I am used to seeing bricks being laid in place one after another in neat lines." "Well now, that is not the quantum way. Here we cannot control where each individual brick goes, only the probability that it will go one place or another. This means that when you have only a few bricks, they can go almost anywhere and seem to have no sort of pattern at all. As the number becomes larger, however, you find that there are bricks only where there is some probability that there should be there. And the probability is higher that you get more bricks. When you have large numbers of bricks involved, it all works out very nicely in the end, so it does. Alice found this all very peculiar, although the foreman spoke so definitely that it sounded as if it might make some sort of strange sense. She did not ask any more questions at this time, as his answers only made her feel more confused than ever. So she thanked him for his information and went on down the road. When Alice stepped through the doorway into the Heisenberg Bank, she found herself in a large pillared hall with marbled walls. It looked much like other banks that she had been in, only this was more intense, as it were. There were a line of cashiers' windows along the far wall, and the vast floor area was divided up by portable tape barriers so that the customers would be divided into regular lines as they waited to be served. At the moment, however, the place appeared to be quite empty of any customers. Apart from the cashier behind the counters and a bank guard standing by the door, Alice did not see anyone. As she had been advised to ask for information at the bank, she began to walk purposely toward the distant line of windows. "Now, you just wait a minute," called the guard by the door. "Where do you think you're going, young miss? Can't you see there is a line?" "I'm sorry," replied Alice, "but I actually can't see a line. There are no people here." "There certainly are, and a lot of them," answered the guard emphatically. "We seem to have quite a rush of no people today. Usually, though, we refer to them as virtual. I have seldom seen quite so many virtual particles waiting to get their energy loans." Alice had a by now familiar feeling that we were not going to become all that much more clearly very quickly. She looked over at the window and saw that, although the room still appeared to be quite empty, the cashiers were all very busy. As she watched, she saw bright figures appear one at a time in front of one till or another, and then rush quickly from the bank. At one till, she saw a pair of figures materialize together in front of a grill. One she recognized as an electron. The other one was similar, but a sort of photographic negative of the first, opposite in every way to the electrons she had just seen previously. "That is a positron, an anti-electron," murmured a voice in her ear. Alice looked around and saw a severe-looking, smartly dressed young woman. "Who are you?" she asked. "I am the bank manager," replied the companion. "I am in charge of the distribution of energy loans to all the virtual particles here. Most of them are photons, as you can see, but sometimes we get pairs of particles and antiparticles who come along together to ask for a loan, like the electron and positron pair that you were just looking at." "Why do they need an energy loan?" asked Alice, "and why can't I see them before they get it?" "Well, you see," replied the manager, "in order for a particle to exist properly, so that it can be a free particle and be able to move around and be observed normally and so on, it has to have, at the very least, a certain minimum amount of energy, which is what we call its rest mass energy. These poor virtual particles don't even have that energy. Most of them have no energy at all, so they do not really exist. Fortunately for them, they can get a loan of energy here at the bank, and this allows them to exist for a little while. This is called the Heisenberg relation. It governs all our transitions. The relation gives the rate of exchange of our energy loans. The equation delta E is the amount of energy which is borrowed. "You mean," said Alice, trying to follow what the manager was saying, "that it looks like an exchange rate between different types of money, so that the more time there is, the more energy they can have." "Oh no, quite the reverse. It's the energy and time multiplied together which are constants. So the greater the amount of energy, the shorter amount of time they are allowed to keep it. If you want to see how I mean, just look at that exotic particle and antiparticle that I've just taken a loan at window number 7. Alice looked where she was directed and observed a striking sight. In front of the window was a pair of figures. One was the opposite of the other, in much the same way as the electron and positron that she had seen earlier. This pair, however, were bright, flamboyant figures, taking up so much space in their presence that they quite obscured the cashier behind them. Alice could not but be impressed by the extravagance of the two, but as she opened her mouth to make a comment, they grew hazy and then vanished completely. That is an illustration of what I was saying, continued the manager. That pair took out an enormous energy loan to support the huge rest mass that they needed for their lifestyle. Because the loan was so large, the repayment time was very short indeed, so short that they did not even manage to leave the counter before it had to be repaid. Because such heavy particles cannot get very far before they have to repay their energy, they are known as short-range particles. Okay, now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Actually, we'll just call that good. Anyway, the next section is going to be really, really long. So anyway, so it's just a nice little allegory story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want the book, it's a pretty good read. So anyway, so I'll get more information out to you. So all right.